Trump just posted "Thank you to Iran" in capital letters on Truth Social. Not after a peace deal. Not after Iran surrendered. After Iran reopened the Strait of Hormuz on its own terms. Think about what that means. The United States spent 48 days bombing Iran, deployed 16 warships, stationed 10,000 troops in the region, imposed a full naval blockade, threatened to destroy Iran's power grid, its energy infrastructure, its entire economic capacity. Pete Hegseth stood at the Pentagon podium and said directly to Iran, "And I want you to hear these words, you can't control anything." And when it was all over, the American president typed "Thank you" in capital letters. That is not what maximum pressure looks like when it works. That is not what you can't control anything produces. Something else happened here, and the mainstream media is not going to tell you what it is. If this channel helps you see through the noise on stories like this, hit subscribe right now. We break down the structure behind the headlines every week, and this story is one of the most important ones we've covered. Let me give you the one number that explains everything. China's official customs records show zero Iranian oil imports since 2022. Zero. Not reduced, not declining, zero. Officially, China has not bought a single barrel of Iranian crude in 3 years, and yet in 2025, China recorded 1.3 million barrels per day of crude oil arriving from Malaysia. There is one problem with that figure. Malaysia's total oil production is approximately 600,000 barrels per day. China was officially importing more than double what Malaysia is physically capable of producing. That oil was Iranian. The paperwork said Malaysian. That single gap between what the official records say and what physically moved is the entire story of why Iran survived 48 days of the most intensive American bombing campaign in the Middle East since the Gulf War. It is the reason Iran got to choose when to open the Strait of Hormuz, not America, Iran. So how did this happen? How does a country absorb 48 days of sustained bombing, a naval blockade involving 16 warships and 10,000 personnel, maximum financial sanctions, and still walk out of it, choosing its own exit terms? The answer is an economic architecture that China spent a decade building, and Washington either did not see it coming or decided not to take it seriously. Either way, the results are now visible for every government on Earth to study. Here's what that architecture actually looks like. 3 core components. First, the oil payment system. American sanctions work by cutting countries off from SWIFT, the global network that connects banks and processes international dollar payments. No SWIFT access means you cannot receive dollars. You cannot pay for imports. You cannot pay your military. You cannot function as a modern economy. That is the design. That is how America turns financial access into political leverage. China broke that design by building around it. For years, China has been paying for Iranian oil in Chinese yuan, routed through second-tier Chinese banks that have no exposure to American financial enforcement. These banks do not operate in the dollar system. They have no assets America can freeze, no correspondent relationships America can threaten. The yuan flows from Chinese refineries directly to Iranian accounts through channels that the SWIFT cutoff simply does not touch. America designed a wall. China built a door in the wall and handed Iran the key. Second, the dark fleet. Chinese-linked tankers operating what analysts call the shadow fleet or dark fleet physically disable their AIS transponders, the GPS tracking systems that tell satellite monitoring services where ships are located. These vessels sail invisibly. They meet other tankers in international waters far from any port. Transfer Iranian crude onto vessels carrying clean flags and clean ownership paperwork. And those vessels then dock at Chinese refineries with nothing in the documentation linking the oil back to Iran. This is where the 1.3 million Malaysian barrels came from. Iranian oil loaded onto Iranian-connected tankers, transferred at sea onto vessels flying Malawian or Panamanian or other flags, then recorded in Chinese customs as Malaysian or Iraqi or Omani crude. The physical oil moved. The paper trail pointed somewhere else entirely. America built financial walls around Iran's oil revenue. China built invisible logistics that moved the oil straight through them. Third, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Before this conflict started, China had already stockpiled approximately 1.2 billion barrels of crude oil in strategic storage, built over 2 years, by purchasing Iranian and Russian sanctioned crude at heavily discounted prices. When the Strait of Hormuz closed and global oil prices spiked past $120 a barrel, China did not panic. Its refineries kept running, its factories kept producing, its market stayed stable. Meanwhile, the IEA chief stood in front of cameras and warned that Europe had approximately 6 weeks of jet fuel supply left. China had 4 months of cover sitting in warehouses. The energy shock that America calculated would create unbearable pressure on Iran by crashing global markets, rattling its regional supporters, and forcing a rapid negotiated surrender, landed everywhere except the one country America needed it to land on. China had already neutralized that weapon before the conflict began. Now, here is what is critical to understand about China's role, because the mainstream framing gets this completely wrong. China is not Iran's military ally. China did not fire a single shot in this conflict. When a Chinese-owned tanker attempted to pass through the strait under a Malawian flag with a spoofed transponder, it turned back after American warnings. China has stayed carefully and deliberately below the threshold of direct military confrontation with the United States throughout this entire episode. What China is, and what it has been for years, is Iran's economic insurer. The country that bought the oil America was trying to embargo. The country that vetoed the UN Security Council resolution that would have authorized international enforcement to reopen the strait by force. The country that used its strongest diplomatic language to call the American blockade dangerous and irresponsible. The country whose foreign minister Wang Yi called his Iranian counterpart before the strait reopened and signaled that China was ready to support a diplomatic path forward. That call matters enormously because it gave Iran exactly what it needed to frame the strait reopening not as a forced military surrender, but as a calculated diplomatic gesture linked to the Lebanon ceasefire. Iran did not say, "We give up, the strait is open." Iran said, in recognition of the Lebanon ceasefire, "We are opening the strait as a goodwill measure." Then America said, "Thank you." That is a completely different thing. And that difference between capitulation and a strategic gesture was made possible by China providing enough economic oxygen to keep Iran stable, patient, and negotiating from a position of agency rather than desperation. There is a historical moment that puts this in sharp focus. In 1956, Britain and France launched a military operation to retake control of the Suez Canal after Egypt's President Nasser nationalized it. The operation was militarily successful. British and French forces were advancing and winning on the ground. And then the United States told Britain to stop, not through military force, but through a single economic threat. America made clear it would not support the British pound if Britain did not withdraw. Britain's currency reserves were nearly exhausted. Faced with financial collapse rather than battlefield defeat, Britain pulled out. France followed. Nasser kept the canal. History remembers it as Britain's Suez. The moment the British Empire discovered that military success means absolutely nothing when the economic architecture beneath you can be pulled away by a more powerful actor. What just happened at the Strait of Hormuz is America's Suez. Not because America lost on the battlefield, but because America's maximum pressure toolkit, the sanctions, the blockade, the financial warfare, the military campaign ran directly into a counter-architecture that China had spent a decade constructing. An architecture that kept Iran financially alive, kept its oil revenues moving through invisible channels, absorbed the energy shock designed to break its resistance, and gave Iran the patience and stability to choose its own moment, its own conditions, and its own framing. America brought maximum force. China had already built maximum resilience, and the gap between those two things, between what America deployed and what America achieved, is now visible to every foreign ministry and strategic planning office on Earth, which brings us to the question nobody in mainstream commentary is asking. If China's economic architecture is what gave Iran the ability to exit this conflict on its own terms, what does that mean for every future American attempt to use sanctions and blockades against any country with a deep relationship with China? Look at the pattern across the last 3 decades. North Korea has survived American sanctions for 30 years. Venezuela has survived them for years. Russia absorbed the most comprehensive sanction regime in modern history after 2022 and is still conducting a full-scale war in Ukraine. Iran survived 48 days of sustained bombing and a naval blockade and still managed to choose its own exit. In every single case where American economic pressure failed to produce the outcome it was designed to create, the common structural threat is identical. China, its UN payment systems operating outside the dollar, its willingness to be the buyer of last resort for sanctioned exports, its strategic reserves absorbing the energy shocks that sanctions are designed to weaponize, its UN Security Council veto blocking international enforcement mechanisms. This is not a series of accidents. This is a strategy that China has been executing for decades, building an alternative to the American-dominated global financial system. Not through military confrontation, not through dramatic declarations, but through quiet, patient, invisible economic architecture that is extremely difficult for America to directly confront without triggering a much larger conflict. Spain's prime minister said it openly in the middle of this crisis. There is nobody else who can resolve this situation except China. That is not a news comment. That is a structural verdict on the new architecture of global power. So here is where things stand right now. The ceasefire expires in 4 days. Iran still holds enriched uranium. The nuclear question remains completely unresolved. The American blockade on Iranian ports is still in place. The deal is not done. But Iran is now sitting at a negotiating table from an extraordinary position. This is a country that held the world's most critical energy choke point for 48 days. That absorbed the most intensive American military campaign in the region in decades. That survived a full naval blockade. And that still got to choose how and when and on what terms to end the immediate crisis. That negotiating position was built in Beijing, not with soldiers or warships or public declarations of alliance, with UN payment systems, shadow tankers transferring oil at sea, 1.2 billion barrels sitting quietly in Chinese storage facilities, and a UN Security Council veto used at precisely the right moment. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. America deployed 16 warships and 10,000 personnel to control it. And the American president still had to type "thank you" when Iran decided to reopen it. That gap between the power America deployed and the outcome America achieved is China's work. Not through a single dramatic action, through a decade of quiet construction that America was not paying attention to or chose not to take seriously. Every major empire in history has faced a moment when it discovered that the rules of the game changed while it was not watching. America is facing that moment now, not at the end of a barrel, at the end of a decade of invisible economic architecture built by a country that never once had to fire a shot to make it work. Watch the next round of negotiations carefully. Not for what Iran demands, for what China does not say. Because in this story, as in every major strategic shift in modern history, the most important actor is the one who built the most while saying the least. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Do you think America's sanctions toolkit is broken for good? Or is there a way back? Because that answer determines everything about the next 10 years of global power. And subscribe if you want to be the person in the room who actually understands what is happening before everyone else catches.